To quote the great Jimi Hendrix, knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. You're listening to The Wisdom Project, a podcast that does just that. We listen.
My name is Doug Boyd, Director of the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History in the University of Kentucky Libraries.
And I'm Kopana Terry, Oral History Archivist for the Nunn Center.
We are back from our extended break.
In fact, our break was so extended, we're now calling this the beginning of Season 2.
Episode number 6 of The Wisdom Project is the kickoff episode of Season 2. We will be kicking into a new gear with Season 2.
And we will definitely have more episodes.
And those episodes will be available on a far more regular basis, I promise, so stay tuned. This episode tells a story that I've been telling various parts of in lecture form for a few years now. I've told it so many times I feel a bit hesitant to put it in podcast form, but I'm going to do so. So here goes. There are few characters in this story. The first character I will introduce is, well, the Oral History Archive. The Nunn Center has been conducting interviews on a variety of topics since 1973. By the end of 2016, we will have conducted over 10,000 interviews. Most of us got into the oral history business because we feel that individual stories play an important role in history. This is why we interview. This is why we conduct extensive research, travel to people's homes to record hours of stories. This is why we ask questions, and this is why we listen. But the Nunn Center does more than just interview. We're an archive charged with curating, preserving, and providing access to our oral history interviews. So in 2008, we began efforts to enhance access to our oral history collections at the Nunn Center.
The first goal was discovery.
You have to find what you're looking for in order to use it. So in 2008, 2009, we created SpokeDB, an online catalog of oral history interviews.
Located at KentuckyOralHistory.org. Spoke is where we tell the world who we have interviewed and what they talk about.
But that's not enough. Again, we're talking about interviews that average 1 to 2 hours in length, sometimes as many as 4 to 5 hours. Without transcripts, the researcher has a challenging time efficiently navigating that material.
You pretty much have to sit down with your headphones and listen and read.
So in 2008, we created something called OHMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, to enhance access to online oral history. Connect a text search to not just the 4-hour interview, but to the corresponding moment in the 4-hour interview. So you search on a word, it takes you to the moment when that person says the word.
So thanks to Spoke and OHMS, we now receive reference requests to access our interviews from all over the world, which brings us to the second character in the story.
Giovanni Caruso. In February of 2013, Giovanni sent us an email request from Tremensuoli, Italy, a small town on the coast about halfway between Rome and Naples. He was requesting an interview from our World War II veterans collection. Now, during World War II, there was a brutal 6-month effort on the part of the Allies to break through something called the Gustav Line, which was designed by the Germans to defend this region of Italy, which included the small town of Tremensuoli. So Giovanni was requesting an interview from our World War II veterans collection that discussed the activities in Tremensuoli.
Now, in full disclosure, this story takes place in a period the Nunn Center often refers to as pre-Co. So the archivist before me received the email request to access this interview. We had the online description of this interview and Spoke, but the actual interview audio and transcript was not yet available online.
So Giovanni had to more formally request access to the interview by way of email. The interview he was requesting was a 4-hour interview with an individual named Marshall Webb, who was from Campbellsville, Kentucky, recorded in 1986 by Colonel Arthur L. Kelly.
Now, if we're talking about characters in the story, Marshall Webb is absolutely the lead character.
The online description of Webb's interview indicated that in this interview, he talked about his experiences fighting in this small town of Tremensuoli.
And the little town is called?
Tremensuoli. That's where we were at for roughly 3 months. At 11 o'clock, the 5th Army and the 8th Army, the English 8th Army, they stretched all the way across Italy. At 11 o'clock, not 1 minute before and 1 minute after, as I said in that poem, hell broke loose. And that's when we pushed off from Tremensuoli.
In fact, the archival description mentions that during the interview, Webb reads a poem that he had written about the Battle of Tremensuoli.
Now, that's not your typical World War II veteran oral history interview experience, is it?
Definitely not. So let's take a listen to Marshall Webb's poem.
Somewhere in Italy, on the 11th of May, we waited for our orders one cool, cloudy day. As we waited patiently and darkness drew near, we received our orders to have no fear. As I looked at my watch, it was just even 10. At 11 was our H hour, then hell would begin. As we stood in the darkness, sweating out the time, waiting to attack that gust of flame. The moon was like a searchlight as we reached no man's land. I put my trust in God, and He took me by the hand. He's the one that gave me courage, faith that I wouldn't mind, gave me strength to push forward, burst through that gust of flame. As we struggled to push forward, how the shells whistle and whine, yet I had my trust in God that the next one wasn't mine. As the sweat stood on my forehead, there was lots on my mind, but now the American doughboys were crossing over the gust of flame. As we reached our main objective, but just at the break of day, death and hell struck our company. All around me my buddies lay. As I knelt down by my buddy, he knew it was his time. Thank God we won our victory. We hold the gust of flame. You can talk of all your battles, and history it will tell, but the one fought at Tremensuoli was sure a bloody hell.
Mission accomplished. We connected the researcher with this important interview. The system worked. Researcher types keywords into Google and is connected to our oral history archive. That's what we do, right?
Well, we soon learned that this was not an ordinary reference request. This researcher did not just want any oral history interview with any veteran in our archive talking about fighting in the Battle of Tremensuoli. He specifically wanted the interview with Marshall Webb. When we inquired why, he emailed a photograph. The photograph was of a tiny alley in the small town of Tremensuoli, stone buildings all around, and when you zoomed in, you saw that on March 30th, 1944, Marshall Webb, our Marshall Webb from Campbellsville, Kentucky, off fighting in the small town in Italy, half a world away, carved his name on the wall in that alley.
That's incredible. And what are the chances?
Right.
What are the chances?
He was able to triangulate graffiti on a wall to our 4-hour interview in the archive. So you look at the photograph, you see M.A. Webb, Seville, KY, 1944, March 30. Giovanni was just not conducting general research on World War II in this small town. He wanted to know who was this American GI who carved his name on the wall.
That is seriously awesome.
We went back and forth with Giovanni for a few days. He sent us other photographs of the alley. He mapped the area. He sent us this map with arrows.
Wait. Did you track down Marshall Webb? Was he still in Campbellsville, Kentucky?
Oh, yeah. That was my first thought. We got to find this guy. Unfortunately, he had passed away in 2004. However, I did connect with Marshall's family. And a few weeks later, we took a videographer down to Campbellsville and interviewed Opal Webb, Marshall's widow, and their son Roger Webb, who had driven down from Chicago. So Mrs. Webb told me about Marshall, their family, their lives together in Campbellsville and living outside of Chicago. She talked about Marshall's poetry. He was a poet. He didn't think of himself as a poet, but he wrote poetry. The poem that he read during the interview was one of over 80 poems that Marshall wrote during the war. Now, she and Marshall did not meet until after the war. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to ask her about whether Marshall had ever spoken about carving his name on this wall in Italy. Did he ever mention that he carved his name in a wall?
He never mentioned, but he carved his name on everything. If you could go through the Pikes Ridge woods out there where he grew up, his initials are on everything. I think my son climbed a tree once when they were deer hunting and found his dad's initials and a date way up on the tree. So, yeah, he did.
He was just doing what he always did.
He's doing what he always did. He wrote all the time.
That's fantastic. That's a great story.
But if you notice on the side of that, there is a heart. I don't know if you noticed or not. On the right side of that picture, there's a heart, so you never know. He was 20 years old. He might have had a girlfriend there. Who knows?
I love so many things about this story. It really is an incredible, it's a small world after all story, isn't it?
Some people say it's a coincidence, and in the beginning I totally bought into that. But the further into the story we got, the more proud of the Nunn Center I became, the more active I felt in the process. We had worked really hard to make online access to our interviews efficient and effective. We put in place a system that made Giovanni Caruso's discovery possible.
Now, Marshall Webb's interview was 4 hours long. He surely talked about something else besides Tremensuoli.
In fact, he rarely talked about Tremensuoli. Tremensuoli was a sliver of a topic in this interview. If he hadn't broken out into the poem that he wrote about this, Tremensuoli may have not ever even made it into the official archival keywords and description, which would have meant that Google wouldn't have picked up on the fact that Marshall talked about Tremensuoli at all. The most powerful portion of this interview is about the fact that Marshall had been part of the group that went in just hours after the liberation of Dachau, the concentration camp. While describing the concentration camp, this of course was an audio recording, they were clearly referencing photographs that they were looking at right there during the interview, photographs that Marshall had in his personal collection. Now, I'm always really interested in memory, and one thing that caught my attention in this interview was the fact that throughout this interview, Marshall could not remember the name of the concentration camp. The interviewer, Colonel Kelly, knew it was Dachau. He even introduces the interview with Marshall by making reference to Dachau concentration camp and Marshall's presence there.
January the 16th, 1986, I'm in Taylor County in the home of Mr. Marshall Webb, a veteran of World War II, served in an infantry company in the 85th Infantry Division, was in Africa, fought his way up through Italy on fought battles on the two major defensive lines, the Gothic and Gustav lines, and fought up through Austria and into Czechoslovakia, and wasn't too far from Munich when the war ended, and ended up at the concentration camp of Dachau, outside of Munich. And Marshall, let's just start right at that point. And
despite that, throughout this interview, Marshall can't recall the name of this concentration camp. The interviewer tries really hard to try and tease it out of him, but Webb just can't make the connection.
All right, what I'm trying to do is kind of, by as much information as we can get, to ascertain whether or not it was Dachau. And
I wished I could remember.
Do you know anything? You know, it's close to Munich. Were you around Munich, or?
No, sir. No.
Did you hear anything about Munich? Did anybody say anything about Munich being close by?
They pulled us from there.
Well, let me ask you this: how did you get to it? Did you walk upon it?
We walked and rode. Most of the time we walked, but sometimes we rode in trucks.
At this time, though, when you come up on this camp,
hardly.
Are you walking or riding?
No, right at the camp we walked. But just before this, or the day before that, we were in tanks, trucks.
So as I mentioned before, Roger the son drove down from Chicago. I'd spoken to Roger a few times on the phone prior to our meeting. I asked him over the phone if his father had ever discussed the concentration camp, but Roger said that his father rarely talked about his war experiences and had not mentioned the name of the concentration camp. So when we met in Campbellsville, Roger had brought down all of his father's World War II material, the photographs, including the ones that they were looking at during the interview, Marshall's handwritten poems, as well as his personal journals.
And by the way, we've now digitized all of these materials and made them part of the archive, and they're available online.
So Marshall kept a personal journal. After all, he was a writer. I remember being in Mrs. Webb's dining room that day with everything spread out across the dining room table, and Roger called me over and said, "You have to see this." He mentioned that this whole thing had made him quite nostalgic and that he went back through his dad's journals. He had in his hand the journal written in 1994, during the time period when Roger's sister Eva passed away after a long struggle with cancer. Roger began reading from the pages.
In his little log, one that we found that he had wrote in his daily pocket that he carried with him, my sister Eva had cancer and passed away. And on here he wrote, "Eva passed away March 28th, Monday, 8:30 p.m., 94, at Seaville Hospital, room 202. And they put down here that her funeral is at 11 o'clock, March 31st at Lion DeWitt Funeral Home. And we're going to put her in Green Garden Memorial Cemetery." And the next page, I just happened to flip it over, and it says, "The name of the prison camp is Dachau."
The entry after writing about the death of his daughter, Marshall simply wrote, "The name of the prison camp is Dachau."
And it must have just snapped that day. That's what it was, because it's just 3 lines, and then right underneath that he says, "Today Eva would have been her birthday, April 7th, 94.
8 years following the oral history interview in 1986, the death of Marshall Webb's daughter, Eva, triggered this memory. The story is important in just so many ways, in so many levels. It's a tremendous commentary on the importance of oral history. Colonel Kelly interviewed so many veterans for the Nunn Center. Had he just simply chosen not to interview Marshall Webb, this connection would not have been possible. It's an even stronger statement about the importance of archives, access, and discovery. Had Giovanni not been able to search for this interview, this connection also would never have been made.
Of course, after this discovery was made, we very quickly began providing access to the Marshall Webb interview using our own system. So you can search the online interview for Tremensuoli and be taken right to the moment in that 4-hour interview when he reads the poem.
Which is important because in oral history, it's the moments that matter. One of the most powerful things about archived oral histories is that each recorded interview contains hundreds, if not thousands, of these moments, filled with content that possesses nearly infinite potential for engaging future researchers or anyone who is interested for whatever reason. Connecting with the family really was my favorite part. Thanks to the Webb family, we now have digitized and preserved Marshall's poems, his journals, his photographs, and we've transformed one person's 4-hour oral history interview into an incredibly rich archival record documenting one soldier's experience in this incredibly detailed way. Finally, when we released the story in 2014, originally in the form of a short YouTube video released on the anniversary of Marshall Webb's carving his name in the wall, so many people, tourists largely, have gone over and photographed Marshall Webb's inscription, or they did rubbings on the wall. The town has put up a plaque next to Marshall Webb's carving, and the plaque contains a photograph of Marshall, a scan of his poem about Tremensuoli, and a link to his online oral history interview. So you can stand in that alley, look at the words carved on a wall, and within a few moments, in a really good international data plane on your mobile phone, listen to this life story of the man who carved these words.
Doug, why do you think Marshall Webb carved his name on that wall? His wife even said that he used to carve his name on trees. Why was he a carver?
I mean, ultimately, I'm guessing it's a form of connection, right? He's making his mark, a sort of Facebook check-in that says, I was there, I was here. And guess what?
Someone listened.
Right. In fact, many people are listening. This story of discovery was really made possible because Giovanni Caruso had the curiosity and the motivation to figure out just who M.A. Webb from Seaville, KY was. Giovanni, if you're listening, someday I will find my way to Tremensuoli and drinks are on me.
And I'm coming with him because Doug rarely buys drinks.
Thanks for listening to this first episode of Season 2 of the Wisdom Project podcast. The podcast is brought to you by the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History in the University of Kentucky Libraries. It's hosted and produced by Doug Boyd and Copanna Terry. The music was written by Doug Boyd. The full interviews used in this episode are available online at KentuckyOralHistory.org. They're searchable using our super cool search system called OHMS that makes audio and video discoverable. We also have photographs, the original YouTube video we produced about the story, Marshall Webb's papers, as well as links to some of the news stories, including the one that contains the photograph of the plaque on the wall in Tremensuoli. It's so cool. These will all be in the show notes. You can find more episodes of The Wisdom Project at thewisdomproject.life. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcasting platform. If you like the Wisdom Project podcast, say something in the form of a review on iTunes. It matters. Like the Nunn Center on Facebook or check out our blog at nunncenter.org. Follow Copanna and I on Twitter at Douglas A. Boyd and at The Real Copanna. And, I've been waiting months to say this, stay tuned for the next episode of The Wisdom Project.